me trying to fumble with Google Classroom until I figure out how to share. Oh dear. Okay.
Well, no problem. We have to accept. You know, all the people have to accept. I can cut it somehow.
Cut the bit where I'm fumbling around like an idiot. What button to press? Okay. So I'm going to talk about fonts as infrastructure. Can you see my title slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, we're off. So it's about half an hour of a talk of this. Cover something that you might know, it's not, because you will all be experiencing fonts as files in your systems or through some font menu in InDesign, and something that is served down to you from a cloud through Adobe Fonts or some subscription system like Type Network or a font rental system like FontStand, depending on the setup that you have at the school, work, or as independent designers. What is important to keep in mind with these is that the fonts are essentially an integral part of a channel of distribution. And you can see parallels there in other areas where things that were physical products have become essentially services. A lot of things like music, for example, are like this, which have migrated into a channel of distribution that essentially controls what kind of access and options you have. Adobe Fonts is the most obvious case here, because what you can or cannot see within an Adobe environment is determined without you having much choice. Now, if we look within a font, and I'm using glyphs here, we see a number of interesting things that are worth paying attention. That the font is essentially a database that holds quite a lot of information, but it also has ways of numbering things and arranging things. And these are views that are available to us, but these are useful to be aware of and how they function in a font. And the most important stuff is that double way of numbering. One is a simple numbering, linear numbering within each font. So everything that each font has a unique number that only has value within that font and makes no sense outside the font. And that is actually quite useful because it allows us to do a number of features. The second is a Unicode number, which is a unique characteristic following an encoding for, let's say, for the sake of argument, every language that is used in the world. We'll be talking more about this in the second week. And you can see that number in the display that you have when you're looking at any glyph. That is unique for any character. The important for this is that, say, the letter N has a unique number, in this case 006E, that is shared with every N in every typeface. I'll also point your attention to the little gray cloud of diacritics on top of the N that you can see here, and to note that this idea of fonts being modular objects that are composed by other shapes that are being borrowed is actually quite old. And this is a drawing from 1943, which shows exactly the same principle. So what we will see later in the week and next week, is that there is this, let's say, habit of technology to reintroduce the same ideas from previous technologies if they've been proven to work, or simply because of habits. Well, this is just a footnote, and I'll go back. Now, the important thing with these enumeration systems, these encodings of characters, that they allow us to have special features, and that's at the heart of how fonts work. In this case, we have a simple feature that converts capitals to small caps, and it's a fairly simple scripting environment where what we see is a simple instruction that says substitute this character by this character. But the characters are identified by their name, or they're identified by their Unicode, by their internal number to the font, which means that this feature operates only within the font. It is not something that will survive outside the font. And this is a small example. For example, we can see something that applies in the case only of italics, and it will substitute within a script that is Latin, within a language that is Serbian, one particular form of the letter by another form of the letter. So in this case, it's a localization of a Cyrillic character for a specific language, for a specific style. The shape of the letter might change, but the letter itself will transfer across systems in a uniform manner. And that relies on the Unicode number that we talked about earlier, which is the system that is shared across characters. So for example, this is a typical page from the Unicode standard where we see some indication of how things look on the left page, which is what most designers pay attention to. But actually, this is not the important thing. The important thing is on the right-hand page, where essentially we see a verbal description of something with a number that's associated and a series of equivalences, which say this mark might be composed by these, or might be substituted by these, or behaves in the same way as this. So there's a lot of rules that are fairly clear in how they're structured, that are built into the definition of the characters, and they are transferable across operating systems, across environments, and they are the same across fonts. These features, this combination of a single unique characteristic number that identifies a character, together with features within a font that allow us to have multiple versions of something and so on, allow us to provide typographic support for fairly complex scripts that require local changes, or things that you'll be probably quite familiar with, like Arabic, which has more than one shape for each character. Arabic typically has 3 forms for each letter, an initial, a medial, or final. They are the same letter, so they share one Unicode value, but then they have multiple numbers that operate within the font, so on. So a really important thing is that character sets and the way they're used to implement features can be a hugely powerful tool because it allows a language to express itself. For example, it allows the Serbian version of Cyrillic to look different than the Russian version of Cyrillic, which would be quite important for people in Serbia. But it can also be prohibitive because until the right characters are encoded in Unicode and enable these behaviors, it means that then you do not have the opportunity to actually use the script that you want. So there is this tension between enabling communities to function the scripts through the infrastructure of the fonts and also threatening them if they can't do that. And I will give you a couple of examples. For example, recently in South America, this is from about almost exactly a year ago, an announcement of a thesis written in a local language that until that point had not been integrated in academia. Now, to be able to write an academic document in such a language would require specific diacritics, specific characters, and so on. And this is a case where the technical infrastructure for supporting a script allows a community to function in what we would consider a normal activity. The same thing happens with minority languages or smaller communities that fall under an umbrella or a main language, which might require particular diacritics or even separate scripts. And Southeast Asia is a very frequent example of cases like this, where the presence of some scripts or not might enable communities to function in terms of training the next generation of children to read and write the language, or the language dies out. And that has been picked up by business and so on. There's a lot of discussion about how fonts are essential in enabling communities. And this term of fonts as infrastructure has been actually being popularized. I'm putting a plug there for Pato Magodavata, who's based in Sri Lanka, with whom we've worked quite a lot in this area. And the term of fonts as infrastructure is something that owes a lot to him as a term. So from our point of view, when we're looking at fonts, we're thinking, I'm using fonts to support something, to support English, French, German, Polish. What do I need? There's specific levels that we can, let's say, determine that help us understand. And the reason for this is that the script and the language are not overlapping. There's essentially quite a complex relationship between marks that are used for something and not something else. Now, with Polish, you are quite familiar with the historical problem of imported diacritics, mostly from French typefaces, which had to be adapted to be localized and acceptable to Polish readers. This is a very good example of a technical infrastructure not being developed with a community in mind, and then the local community having or not the facility, the opportunity to make corrections, additions, and so on to scripts. And there is quite a lot of legacy in this, where we might see fonts that are used still in many European languages that carry the legacy of marks, symbols, shapes that were developed for an entirely different environment. And of course, the way we handle these things, how we distribute them, matters quite a lot. So at the base level, there's nothing. This is an academic manuscript where the author has typed something and has just entered manually the letters that they want because their typewriter doesn't do anything. And that happens in a lot of cases even today. So this is a notation that looks Chinese to us, but actually is a separate script for which there is no way of typing it in an established computer system. So what you are left with is people writing things out, and these then photographically or lithographically being produced. If any one of you is in the habit of reading music, music even to these days often is reproduced this way. So the simplest representation we can have is essentially with just one character and for a shape, and with something that is not necessarily transferable. Older fonts are like that. Polish will have had its share of older fonts that were hiding as if they were, say, English fonts and so on, with the diacritics in the wrong places and so on. So these are systems built for a very local environment that would not allow much interchange. And thankfully, we're now very rapidly moving towards supporting very wide interchange by enabling fonts to have Unicode support. So having Unicode values for the characters that we need, which means that we can then send things across and to another system or a device, and the content will survive. And this is at the heart of me emailing you something, or the browser rendering something correctly in English or in Polish or whatever, and this thing happening across many devices. So when we see the fonts in the support that they allow us, in a modern environment for interchange, this is really based on this. But this doesn't give us any stylistic tools to actually produce any refined typography. Text would essentially look just like this. A single font where only space allows us to give some hierarchy and so on. And we can see how these things fail very quickly when we look at online environments that are developed for one script, primarily the Latin script, and they fail when they're trying to represent other scripts. This is a typical case where Sinhala is just not rendered on Facebook, and you see the odd problem of people essentially writing one language without its own native script, but in another script with some sort of phonetic transcription. This happens even in the European environment very easily when we see that things like emails or say electronic systems will not deal with diacritics very well. And a lot of people are getting used to omitting diacritics from their written form simply because their email system won't operate. The other area that is important is that a lot of systems need proper keyboard support. So this is a case for an existing script for which there was no competent, it's Granta, no competent keyboard for rendering the script. So again, if you have a font infrastructure, but you don't know where the correct keys are to hit, again, you don't enable a community to function. We can see actually even in the European sphere a lot of use of things like dashes, punctuation, and so on diminishing as these things are not visible on the keyboard of a computer, and then the lay person, everyday people, do not use them anymore. So basic level of routing, you want to be able to represent the script and so on. So this is an example from what I showed you earlier, a children's book where you might have an English first line, which is a shared language in India, the Odia script first, and then the localized version and so on. So this is fairly simple. It allows you to teach the children how to write and read that language. It doesn't allow you to do much more, because then you need to be able to have some richness in typography. Again, within the Latin script, this is happening a lot. This is for Brazilian indigenous languages, which are primarily oral languages that have grown a written dimension mostly through the study of linguists and so on for them. And they use very complex sets of diacritics, which might not be developed with most of the typefaces that we use, and are not necessarily accessible through keyboards easily. So this is a matter of empowering a community or excluding a community to function normally. So once we look into education, business, administration, we need hierarchy. And this is where typeface design really becomes empowering. Now, the absolute minimum you need is 2 levels of hierarchy. You can see these things in any interactions with authority, where there is some requirement to distinguish between different categories of documents or options in our interaction with another body. So asking what kind of forms do I need to do something that needs essentially list elements and headings and hierarchies. And that is something that is built into our idea of working with interfaces as well, where we see the subtle distinctions in style, but also weight, will give us a sense of how to navigate an environment. So we can see that all of the complex environments that we expect to be able to navigate rely hugely on distinguishing between typefaces that function as choices, as interface list elements, essentially, or things that are content. Again, supporting these things matters hugely, and not being able to do this creates all sorts of odd effects. But these environments that we spend a lot of time on, social media and so on, are very good examples of what do you actually need. So we can see on the left side that there is a distinction in color intensity, but also in weight, with the bit that says newsfeed at the top, to indicate presence in the options of the interface. So that kind of stuff is absolutely critical in enabling these kind of systems. Then what's really important is that you have a more open idea of what your users are. And that has a lot to do with optical sizes. It has a lot to do with enabling different visual conditions to see and so on. And you don't need to go to an extreme to have an accessibility discussion. You don't need to go to someone who has very serious optical conditions, but you can look simply at the difference in optical acuity between someone who is 20 years old and someone who is 40 or 60, who are people who are perfectly within their very productive years, and how their eyes expect to see things at different intensities, clarity, contrast, and so on. So the idea of having typefaces that work for different optical sizes is not a refinement of high typography, which is what used to be the case in print environments, but is an essential element of enabling interaction with documents. The best example of this is if you look at a constrained environment like a mobile device and see how a middle-aged or older person uses it, where they need to have enough text on the page to interact with the content, but actually need perhaps larger letters in order to be able to navigate, to see something clearly. And there you have this sort of tension between having enough words on screen and having large enough words on screen for people to see them. So typefaces that are developed to be as clear as possible and as small as possible a size are an essential element for enabling communities to function through these devices. Now, this is becoming more and more important as the environments that we are working in are changing. And we're not doing a lot of work in this yet, but there is a lot of work being done as a research in research areas or for the rendering of text in AR environments and VR by extension. AR is particularly critical because it will most likely be used for tasks where people are doing something important. Here we see a simple mock-up of let's say a remote medical procedure where important information about the patient is being rendered in a visor that a medical professional is wearing, and you really want to make sure that this stuff is readable. Now, in this case, we have a typographic environment that is quite different from our traditional forms, even for screens, because the background of the typefaces changes constantly. So how typefaces have to adapt when the contrast around the boundary of the letters changes is an area that we're trying to understand better right now. There's different projects at work looking at exactly this. So what is the balance between the typeface responding with the intensity, perhaps, or the thickness of the strokes to the background, or should it actually allow you to read without responding too much to the background? And of course, if you try to do this across other scripts, then you realize that many scripts are much more challenging in this than the Latin because they simply have denser textures on the screen. And of course, I did mention AR primarily, but VR is also an element in this where we do have something that at the moment is mostly being used in gaming environments, but we can see quite near ahead once certain, let's say, hardware issues are sorted, how we might be using VR to do things like what we are doing right now. So me wearing sort of goggles and appearing to be in a studio in Katowice instead of actually having to talk through quite a small screen. That is all around the corner. Of course, then accessibility also means that things will function across many different devices. This is standard practice for any font development. And then the more interesting areas happen when we really try to expand the richness on offer to designers. So for specific genres, like for example, education and so on, you need to be able to provide not just letters that will function effectively for children if they need to copy the shapes from, but also have the right kind of symbols for the arithmetic that the teachers need to do. And so on. So this is a matter that might seem niche, but actually is quite critical for a very large community of people who need to produce things that look in a specific way to support learning plans. And the other area where things are really developing quite quickly is the idea of layered documents and annotated documents that are becoming more and more common to us now. The idea that a document doesn't have one instance, which is a very print-based concept for documents, but essentially has a time dimension during which annotations, comments, highlights, and so on happen on it. And typefaces need to adapt to this so that they can provide the technical infrastructure to allow this kind of thing to happen smoothly and distinguish between different voices, the voice of the author, of the main commentator, of the comment on the comment, then the infrastructure around it, things like report abuse, upvote, or the strap lines need to be differentiated typographically. So there's a lot of elements that need to be integrated in a system, and a lot of them increasingly extend beyond the alphabetic. So things that have to do with symbols, branding elements, and so on, that at the moment are mostly seen as separate symbol sets or separate parts of typefaces, are increasingly being sucked into typefaces so that there's a coordinated behavior. And finally, there is a very market-driven dimension to typefaces where we can see how these things can extend and provide offerings for stylistic cues in what is an area that loses a lot of the physical differentiation. And editorial design is the most interesting area in this, where designers have lost the identification elements of the feel of the paper, the size and heft of the volume, the cues, the navigation cues of handling a bound printed object, and you're all left with just a similar device that then has only typography and color to differentiate from one publication to the next. We can see this being quite a challenge, because increasingly a lot of these publications might either be dominantly online or only online, and therefore you need to have a distinct typographic identity that survives only on screen without the support. So we can then see that the older environment in which a lot of these choices are being based on, essentially local sources, local fonts for an application that just sits on your desktop and produces fixed objects, is a very antiquated idea, whereas we're looking at something that is much more rich, flexible, and allows us to have text on very different environments, probably across many different scripts. And these are also existing with this time dimension of text that are being annotated, commented on, intervened with, and so on with a lot of readers. In closing, there is an interesting generational divide at the moment, because a lot of the people making the decisions for how typography looks are people, to be a bit crude, sort of my generation. So people who have grown up by creating ideas about how typography happens on print editions. So if I'm thinking of a newspaper, even though I have not bought a paper newspaper for maybe 4 or 5 years now, my idea of what a newspaper is influenced by sort of 35 years or 40 years of reading newspapers in print. So this sort of digital representation of a newspaper, to me, means something different than what it does to newer generations of readers who have never ever bought a newspaper in print and are only experiencing the idea of a document with multiple authors and a very frequent refresh rate, and maybe a specific editorial voice as a newspaper. So there's a lot of changes there. The other thing I want to highlight as a footnote and closing is the gradual importation of habits, typographic norms through technological changes. So if I'm looking at something like Chinese and ask someone local, does Chinese have italic? They will say no. But what we can see in the bottom right in this little example is that somebody has actually used an italic button and italicized the Chinese. And there's a lot of examples of things like this because the technology allows it. And people will tend to do things like this if the technology allows it, simply because then it allows them to have a richer typographic representation. And lastly, you'll see right at the bottom, if you think I'm being a bit facetious with this, you can see that the same thing happened with the emoji. So in this case, what we have is a distorted little symbol, which did not respond properly to the typographic command. So the idea of what happens with an emoji when you have it within an italic text is a valid design question. And it's not a bad idea to ask, how should this thing respond? Does it change shape, or does it intentionally not change shape, and so on? Yeah. So the idea of will this play? There we are. Yeah, the idea of having typefaces, as we have with variable fonts now, that are mutable and allow us a lot of options, opens up different ways of supporting these kinds of issues, different levels of enabling communities to function, and also a better view into the role of fonts into communities and societies. Okay, so I will stop now and sort of stop sharing my screen. Stop sharing my screen.